The smoke is a living thing, a black-tongued beast clawing its way into the midnight sky over the town of Redemption Gap. It pours from the windows of the parsonage, a ravenous monster devouring the one place meant to be a sanctuary. Inside, a baby's cry is a thin, desperate needle of sound piercing the roar and crackle of the flames. Reverend Elias Thornclaws at the front door, the wood hot enough to blister his palms, his voice raw from screaming his daughter's name. Sarah! Mary! Where is she? His wife, Mary, is on her knees in the dust of the street, her face a mask of soot and terror. I couldn't get to the crib, Elias. The stairs, the smoke. The men of the town stand frozen, a gallery of silhouettes against the terrible orange glow. They hold buckets they're useless now, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror and a grim, frontier helplessness. The house is an inferno. To enter is to die. The baby is lost. The thought is a cold stone in every man's gut. But then, a shadow detaches itself from the deeper darkness near the livery. It moves with a fluid grace that is utterly out of place in the stiff, panicked crowd. It's the boy, the Apache stray, the one they see but never speak to, the one who lives on the fringes like a ghost. He is small for his age, maybe 15 or 16, with long black hair and eyes that seem to miss nothing. He slips through the stunned crowd, his movements silent and purposeful. He doesn't look at the fire with the same terror as the others. He reads it, his head tilted as if listening to its deadly language. Before Elias can even register his intent, the boy is gone, vanishing not through the blocked front door, but around the side of the house, towards the back where the smoke is thickest. A few men shout, their voices thin against the fire's roar, but it's too late. He has been swallowed by the blaze. A collective sigh of pity and resignation passes through the crowd. A fool's errand. Another soul claimed by the night. Moments stretch into an eternity. The roof begins to groan, threatening collapse. Mary's weeping becomes a low, guttural keen of utter despair. Elias finally sags against a water trough, his hope extinguished. And then, a figure emerges from the blinding smoke. It's him, the boy. He stumbles forward, his shirt smoldering, his face blackened. Cradled against his chest, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, is the tiny, coughing form of baby Sarah. He walks directly to Mary, his steps measured and calm despite the chaos around him, and gently places the child in her mother's arms. He looks at the baby, then at the preacher, his dark eyes holding a deep, unreadable expression. He gives a single, small nod, and before the town's shock can transform into gratitude, he turns and melts back into the shadows from which he came, as silent as a wisp of the smoke he justified. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The silence he leaves behind is more profound than the fire's roar. The town of Redemption Gap stares, dumbfounded, at the miracle they just witnessed. The preacher's baby is alive, saved by the one person they considered less than nothing. But as the flames die down and the cold light of dawn approaches, the town's shock begins to curdle into something else entirely. It hardens into suspicion, into fear, into the old, familiar hatred. And with the rising sun, their verdict will be delivered not with thanks, but with a vote. The town of Redemption Gap had been named with more hope than accuracy. It was a crack in the vast, unforgiving plains, a place where redemption was in short supply and judgment was plentiful. Dust was the town's most abundant resource, coating the false-fronted buildings, settling in the lungs of its people, and clouding their view of the world. They were a community bound not by fellowship, but by a shared, simmering fear of everything that lay beyond their self-imposed borders. The harsh land, the raiding parties they heard stories of but rarely saw, and the quiet, watchful presence of the native people whose land this had once been. The deaf Apache boy was the living embodiment of that fear. He had no name they cared to learn. To them, he was simply the stray or the savage. He had appeared a year prior, a ghost walking out of the heat haze of the prairie, thin and starving, but with an unbreakable stillness in his eyes. He'd made a small, crude shelter for himself in a rocky wash a half-mile from town, a place no one else wanted, and survived on what he could trap or forage. He was deaf. That much they knew. They'd seen in the way he never reacted to a shouted curse or the clang of the blacksmith hammer unless he was looking right at it. He watched. He always watched. His silence and his perceptive gaze were unnerving. It was as if he could hear their thoughts, their spite, their meanness, and it made them hate him for the secrets he seemed to keep. His name was Nantan. He'd been given it by his grandfather, a man who saw a leader's spirit in the quiet boy who learned to read the world not with his ears, but with his feet, his hands, and his eyes. He felt the thunder of running buffalo through the soles of his worn moccasins long before others could hear them. He could read the subtle shift of a bird's flight to know where water was hidden. His silence was not an emptiness. It was a space filled with a different kind of listening. But after his family was lost to the blue-coated soldiers and the sickness that followed, his name felt like a mockery. He was not a leader. He was a remnant, a survivor living on the scraps of a hostile world. Reverend Elias Thorne was new to that world. He had arrived 6 months ago with his wife, Mary, and their newborn daughter, Sarah, full of earnest conviction and a belief in the inherent goodness of man. He was a tall, slightly stooped man with kind eyes and a face that hadn't yet been hardened by the frontier. He saw Redemption Gap not as it was, but as it could be, a flock to be guided, a garden to be tended. He preached sermons on grace and forgiveness to pews of grim-faced ranchers and shopkeepers who listened politely on Sunday and then went back to their lives of hard-bitten pragmatism on Monday. He had noticed the Apache boy, of course. He'd felt a pang of Christian duty, a vague intention to do something for him, but the demands of a new church, a new baby, and a wary congregation had pushed the intention aside. He'd allowed the town's casual prejudice to infect him with a kind of passive complicity. He didn't share their hatred, but he did nothing to challenge it. The primary source of that hatred had a name, Jedediah Croft. Croft was the town blacksmith, a man whose physical power was matched by his unbending will and influential voice on the informal town council. He was a thick, bull-necked man with hands like slabs of iron and eyes the color of a winter sky. He saw the world in simple, brutal terms, strong and weak, insider and outsider, white and savage. Weeks before the fire, Elias had overheard him in the general store. "See him lurking over there?" Croft had growled to another man, jerking his chin towards Nantan, who was standing perfectly still across the street, like a coyote watching a chicken coop. "Mark my words, he's a bad omen. We're soft, letting him stay so close. One day we'll regret it." The other man had just nodded, the sentiment as common and accepted as the dust on his boots. It was this casual, deep-seated poison that Elias had failed to recognize for the threat it was. Now, in the gray, smoky light of the morning after the fire, that poison was no longer dormant. It was active, virulent, and spreading fast. The fire was out, leaving the skeletal, blackened timbers of the parsonage standing like a monument to the night's terror. The initial shock of Sarah's rescue had worn off, replaced by a suspicious, fearful chatter that buzzed through the town like angry hornets. "How'd he know the baby was in that back room?" one woman whispered to another, clutching her shawl tight. "And to get in and out like that, it ain't natural," her companion replied, her eyes wide. "He must have been prowling around the house." Spying. Jedediah Croft let the whispers build, fanning the flames of their fear with his own dark pronouncements. He stood near the smoldering ruins, his arms crossed over his massive chest, his face a thundercloud of righteous anger. "See? I told you all," he boomed, his voice carrying over the small crowd that had gathered. "A wolf doesn't save a lamb out of kindness. It's just waiting for a better chance to strike. He was there because he was up to no good. Maybe he even started the fire himself, hoping to loot the place after we were all distracted." The accusation was monstrous, illogical, but it landed on fertile ground. It was easier to believe the boy was a demon than a hero. It affirmed their worldview, justified their long-held prejudice. To accept his heroism would be to admit they were wrong, that a savage possessed a nobility they themselves lacked. And that was an admission the people of Redemption Gap were not prepared to make. Elias heard it all as if from a great distance. He was sitting on a borrowed chair outside the mercantile, Mary beside him, rocking a sleeping, soot-stained Sarah in her arms. Every fiber of his being screamed with a gratitude so profound it was physically painful. He owed that boy everything. His daughter's life, his wife's sanity, his own future. The thought of Croft's ugly words made a hot, unfamiliar anger rise in his throat. He stood up, his body aching, and walked towards the crowd. "That's enough, Jedediah," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "You're talking nonsense, and you know it. That boy is a hero. He saved my daughter when no one else could." Croft turned slowly, a contemptuous smirk on his face. "A hero, preacher? Or a lucky devil? You're new here. You don't understand the way things are. You see a poor, stray pup. We see the wolf it'll grow into. His kind and ours we can't mix. It ain't safe. He saved a child's life." Elias insisted, his voice rising. "That is the only fact that matters here. He risked his own life for a stranger, for a baby, and we'll be paying him back for his trouble," Croft said, his eyes glinting, "by making sure he doesn't get a chance to cause any more of it. We're having a town meeting at dawn tomorrow in the church. We're going to vote on it. For the safety of our families, we're voting him out. For good." The finality in Croft's voice was like a slammed door. He turned his back on Elias, his point made, his authority asserted. The crowd murmured in agreement. It was decided. Elias stood there, alone, the cold reality of the situation washing over him. He had come to Redemption Gap to teach these people about grace, and they were about to use his own church as the venue for an act of profound, cruel injustice. He looked from Croft's broad, unyielding back to the blackened shell of his home. He owed his daughter's life to a boy the town was about to crucify, and his own conscience was now on trial. That afternoon, driven by a debt that felt sacred, Elias went looking for Nantan. He followed the faint tracks away from the town, towards the desolate stretch of land that bordered the creek. He found the boy's shelter tucked into the side of a sun-baked arroyo, a lean-to made of scavenged lumber and packed earth, barely bigger than a dog run. It was a testament to a desperate, lonely survival. Nantan was sitting outside, carefully treating the burns on his forearms with a poultice of chewed herbs. He looked up as Elias approached, his body instantly tense, his hand hovering near a rock. He had the wariness of a creature that had only ever known cruelty from men like Elias. The preacher stopped a good 10 feet away, holding his hands up, palms out, to show he meant no harm. I came to thank you," Elias said, his voice feeling loud and clumsy in the immense silence of the prairie. He remembered the boy was deaf and felt a flush of foolishness. He pointed to his own heart, then made a gesture of giving, and finally pointed at Nantan. "Thank you." Nantan watched him, his eyes narrowed, trying to decipher the meaning. Elias tried again. He mimed rocking a baby, then pointed towards the sky as if to indicate smoke, his face contorted in a mask of fear. Then he pointed at Nantan and brought his hands together over his heart, bowing his head slightly. Gratitude, respect. A flicker of understanding crossed the boy's face. His posture relaxed, just a fraction. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He had understood. Elias had brought a parcel wrapped in cloth. He set on the ground between them a loaf of bread, a hunk of cheese, and a small jar of Mary's preserved peaches. A fortune for someone living as Nantan did. The boy looked at the offering, then back at Elias, his expression unreadable. He did not move to take it. The gulf of culture, of language, of experience between them was a chasm. Elias felt a profound sense of failure. He had offered crumbs of charity when what was owed was a fortress of protection. He backed away slowly, leaving the food where it was. As he turned to leave, he saw Nantan finally move. The boy picked up the parcel, his movements deliberate. He unwrapped it, looked at the contents, and then raised his eyes to meet Elias's one last time. There was no warmth in his gaze, but there was a deep, searching intelligence. It was the look of someone weighing a man's soul, and Elias felt painfully unworthy. He walked back to town with a heavy heart. That night, sleep offered no escape. He and Mary were staying in a spare room above the mercantile, the unfamiliar sounds of the building settling around them. Sarah slept peacefully in a lone cradle, her breathing soft and regular, a constant, beautiful reminder of the debt he owed. "What are we going to do, Elias?" Mary whispered in the darkness. Her voice was thin with exhaustion and fear. She was a good woman, a strong woman, but the frontier was wearing her down. She was grateful to the boy, fiercely so, but she was also a mother who feared for her child's safety, and the town's collective anger was a palpable threat. "Jedediah Croft, he has everyone wound up. If you stand against him, what choice do I have, Mary?" Elias murmured, staring at the ceiling. "They want to use our church, the house of God, to commit a sin. They want to punish a boy for an act of Christ-like love. If I stand by and let that happen, what kind of preacher am I? What kind of man? A man who keeps his family safe," she answered, her voice trembling. "They'll run us out of town, Elias. Or worse. These are hard people. He is just a boy," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "A lonely, deaf boy who walked through fire for our daughter. If I don't stand for him, who will?" The next day, the tension in Redemption Gap was a physical presence. People avoided Elias's eyes in the street. Doors that were usually open were closed. He saw Nantan once, from a distance, slipping into the livery to water the horse of the old, cantankerous doctor who was the only other person in town who showed the boy any kindness. As Nannan came out, one of Croft's cronies, a lanky cowboy named Finn, deliberately spat on the ground inches from his feet. Nannan didn't flinch. He simply paused, his eyes sweeping over Finn's sneering face, and then he continued on his way, his back straight, his dignity a silent, infuriating shield. The small act of aggression, and Nanton's refusal to be baited by it, only seemed to fuel the town's simmering rage. That afternoon, Croft and two other men from the council came to see Elias at the mercantile. "Reverend," Croft began, his tone falsely polite, "we just want to make sure we're all in agreement about the meeting tomorrow. For the good of the town, we need a unified voice on this. The only thing I am in agreement with, Jedediah, is that a great debt is owed to that boy," Elias said, his hands clenched at his sides. Croft's politeness vanished. "The debt is paid. The child is alive. Now we deal with the snake we found in the nursery. We're offering him a chance to leave peacefully. That's more mercy than his kind would show us." "His kind?" Elias shot back, his temper finally breaking. "His kind is a hero, a child who showed more courage than any man in this town, myself included." "You're a fool, preacher," Croft sneered, stepping closer until he loomed over Elias. "Blinded by sentiment. This isn't the city. This is the frontier. There are rules. He broke them by existing. Tomorrow, at dawn, we're restoring order. I advise you to remember whose side you're on. The Lord might provide, but it's this town that feeds your wife and child." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. After they left, Elias felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. Mary was right. He was risking everything. His family's well-being, their home, their future, all for a boy he didn't know, a boy who wouldn't even take food from his hand. The weight of his conscience was becoming an unbearable burden. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the dusty street, a small object appeared on the doorstep of the mercantile. It was a bird carved from a piece of soft cottonwood, its wings outstretched in flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather etched with a patient, skillful hand. It was impossibly delicate, a thing of pure, simple beauty. Elias picked it up, his rough fingers gentle on the smooth wood. He knew, with absolute certainty, who had left it. It wasn't a payment. It wasn't a plea. It was a message, sent across the chasm of silence and mistrust. It was a gift for the baby. He held the small wooden bird in his palm, its fragile form a stark contrast to the ugliness that was consuming his town. This was the soul of the boy they called a savage. This quiet artistry, this gentle instinct. And in that moment, the last of his doubt burned away, leaving only a core of cold, hard resolve. He knew what he had to do. The cost no longer mattered. The night before the vote was the longest of Elias Thorne's life. He didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, the wooden bird in his hand, and prayed. He did not pray for guidance. For the first time in a long time, the path was blindingly clear. He prayed for the strength to walk it. He prayed for his wife's safety, for his daughter's future, and for the soul of a town so lost it could no longer tell a monster from a saint. He thought about the life Nan must have lived, the loneliness and fear, the constant vigilance. He tried to imagine the world through the boy's eyes, a world of shapes and vibrations, of silent mouths moving in anger, of kindness so rare it must have seemed like a trap. He thought of the fire, of the smoke and the heat, and the incredible, selfless courage it took for that boy to walk into a furnace for a child he didn't know, a child of the people who despised him. It was an act of grace, so pure it shamed every sermon Elias had ever preached. He looked at Mary, sleeping fitfully, her brow furrowed, even in slumber. He was afraid, not for himself, but for her. He was about to shatter the fragile peace of their lives, to lead them into an exile of his own making. But to do otherwise, to bow to Croft's mob, would be to shatter his own soul, and that was a price he would not pay. Long before the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, Elias rose. He dressed quietly, putting on his black preacher's coat like a suit of armor. He tucked the small wooden bird into his pocket. He left Mary a note on the bedside table, just 3 words, "I love you." Then he slipped out of the room and walked through the silent, sleeping town towards the one place he still thought of as his, the church. The door creaked as he opened it. The air inside was cold and smelled of old wood and beeswax. The pews were empty, standing in silent, ordered rows. He had expected to be alone, to gather his thoughts before the storm broke. But he was not. There, in the faint light filtering through the tall, arched windows, stood a solitary figure. It was Nantan. The boy wasn't praying. He wasn't hiding. He was standing perfectly still, looking up at the church's only real treasure, a stained-glass window depicting the parable of the Good Samaritan. The morning light, still weak, illuminated the colored glass, showing the Samaritan tending to the wounded man on the road while the priest and the Levite walked away in the background. Nantan's head was tilted, his gaze intense, as if he were reading the story in the light itself. He had seen the men of God walk away. He had seen the outsider, the scorned one, be the only one to show mercy. He understood the story better than anyone in that town. Elias stopped in the aisle, his heart catching in his throat. The boy's presence in this place at this moment was a revelation more powerful than any divine vision. Here was the truth, standing silent and alive before him. This was not about politics or prejudice or frontier justice. It was about recognizing God in the face of the outcast, about seeing grace in an act of selfless courage. Nantan must have felt the vibration of his footsteps on the wooden floor. He turned, his eyes meeting Elias's across the length of the church. There was no fear in his expression, only a deep, weary resignation. He clearly expected no help from this place or this man. He had come to look at the picture, a final, silent observation before he disappeared back into the wilderness that was safer than the company of men. Elias knew then that his decision was no longer just about his own conscience. It was about honoring the truth that stood before him. The deadline of dawn was approaching. The town would be here soon, bringing their hatred into this sacred space. His tactical plan, his prepared words, they all felt small and insufficient. All that mattered now was the simple, terrifying act of standing for what was right, not for victory, but for the act itself. He would not let them cast this boy out. He would not let them win. He walked slowly up the aisle until he was standing beside Nantan, and together, in silence, they watched the colors of the Good Samaritan grow brighter as the sun began to rise. The heavy oak doors of the church groaned open, letting in the cold morning air and the first of the townspeople. They entered not with the reverence of a congregation, but with the grim determination of a jury. They filed into the pews, their faces hard and set, their eyes avoiding the pulpit and the tall, stained-glass window. They were here for a purpose, a cleansing. Jedediah Croft was last to enter, moving with the slow, confident swagger of a man who knew he held all the power. He saw Elias standing at the front, but his gaze passed over him as if he were a piece of furniture, and then he took his place in the front pew, the seat of judgment. Nantan was gone. Elias had gestured for him to wait outside, to hide in the trees beyond the cemetery, not wanting to subject him to the ugliness to come. The boy had looked at him, a long, searching look, and then had simply vanished, leaving Elias to face the tide alone. Croft rose to his feet without preamble. The church was not a place of worship this morning. It was a courtroom, and he was the prosecutor. "We all know why we're here," he began, his voice a low rumble that filled the silent space. "We're here for the safety of this town, for our children." He let his gaze sweep across the faces, pausing on the mothers. "Last night, we got a warning, a clear sign. The Apache boy, the stray, was where he shouldn't have been. Some are calling him a hero." A scoffing sound rippled through the pews. "I say we were lucky. Lucky he didn't have worse intentions. Lucky he only scared us. We can't afford to wait for the next time when we might not be so lucky. His kind brings trouble. It's in their blood. I say we vote, right now, to send him on his way, to escort him to the edge of the county and make it clear he ain't to return. For the good of Redemption Gap. All in favor." He raised his own thick arm, a signal. All around the church, hands went up. Hard, weathered hands of ranchers, calloused hands of laborers, the hands of men who had been Elias's friends, the hands of women who had cooed over his daughter. It was a forest of condemnation, near unanimous. A few people hesitated, their eyes flicking towards Elias, but the pressure of the crowd was too much. More hands joined the others. It was then that Elias moved. He didn't mount the pulpit to preach. He simply walked to the center of the chancel, into the pool of light from the Good Samaritan window. He stood there, silent, until every eye was on him. "Before you make this final," he said, his voice quiet but carrying with an intensity that cut through the hostile atmosphere, "I want you to think about what you are doing." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He spoke with the chilling calm of a man who had already passed through the fire of his own fear. "2 nights ago, my house was burning. I was helpless. You were helpless. Every man here stood and watched as my daughter, my Sarah, was about to be burned alive." He paused, letting the memory, the shame of it, settle in the room. And one person did not watch. One person walked into that furnace. A boy you have scorned and spat on and called a savage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small wooden bird. He held it up in the palm of his hand, its delicate wings catching the light. "This is the soul of the savage you fear. He left this for my daughter. After saving her life, he asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He gave this." He then turned his back on them and pointed up at the stained glass window, its colors now brilliant in the full morning sun. "You sit here in the house of God beneath this window. You've seen it every Sunday. A story about a man beaten and left for dead. A priest came by, a man of God like me, and he walked on the other side. A Levite, a respected man of the community like you, Jedediah, he also walked by. They were too busy, too important, too afraid to help." He turned back to face them, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire that eclipsed the one that had taken his home. And then a Samaritan came, a man who was hated, an outcast, a man your ancestors would have called a savage. And he was the one who showed mercy. He was the one who acted like a neighbor. He was the one who pleased God. Elias let his arm fall to his side. "That boy, Nantan, is the Samaritan. And you are the priest and the Levite, walking away, convincing yourselves that your hardness is wisdom. You want to vote him out. You want to cast out the one person in this town who has lived up to the lesson in that window." He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the silent, stunned faces. "So go ahead, take your vote. But know this," he straightened to his full height, his stoop gone, his voice ringing with unshakable conviction. "If you vote to cast him out, you vote to cast me out too. For I will not be the preacher of a congregation of Levites. I will not raise my daughter in a town that punishes goodness and rewards cruelty. If he goes, we go, my family, and I will walk out of this town with him." A collective gasp went through the church. This was not a sermon. It was an ultimatum, an act of pastoral suicide. Croft's face, which had been smug and triumphant, was now a mask of purple fury. He had expected a lecture, not a mutiny. And then a new sound, the rustle of fabric from the front pew. Mary Thorne rose to her feet. Her face was pale as death, her knuckles white where she clutched a sleeping Sarah to her chest. But her eyes were fixed on her husband, and in them was not fear, but a fierce, unwavering pride. She walked steadily to his side, turning to face the congregation with him, her presence a silent, powerful second to his declaration. The sight of the woman, the mother, and the baby, the very child at the center of it all, standing in defiance, shattered the mob's unity. It was one thing to cast out a faceless stray. It was another to drive out their own preacher and his family. Hands began to waver. One by one, then in small groups, they dropped. Men looked down at the floorboards, unable to meet Elias's gaze. Women looked at Mary and the child in her arms, and a flicker of shame, of humanity, returned to their eyes. "What is this?" Croft roared, his power slipping through his fingers. "He's bluffing. Vote. Raise your hands." But the spell was broken. Only a few of his most ardent followers kept their hands raised. The vote, which seconds ago had been a landslide, had faltered. It was a stalemate, a messy, grudging impasse born not of enlightenment, but of a confrontation they could not win without becoming undeniable monsters. Defeated, but not repentant, Croft slammed his fist on the back of the pew in front of him. "This is a mistake," he spat, and stormed out of the church, his allies following in his wake. The rest of the congregation shuffled out in a cloud of murmurs and resentful silence, leaving Elias, Mary, and Sarah standing alone in the vast, empty room. The cost of their victory was palpable. They had won the battle, but they had lost the town. They found Nantan where Elias had left him, at the edge of the woods beyond the cemetery. He had a small, tight bundle on his back. He had been waiting not for a verdict, but for the people to disperse so he could leave unseen. He saw the three of them approaching, and his body became still, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He expected nothing but the final, official order to be gone. Elias stopped a few feet away. Words were useless, and he knew it. His actions would have to speak for him now. He held out his empty hand, palm up, an offering of peace. Then, slowly, he pointed from the parsonage's smoking ruins to the small, intact house that belonged to the town doctor, who was old and planning to move on. Then he pointed to himself, to Mary and the baby, and then, most deliberately, he pointed to Nantan. He brought his fingers together, a gesture of gathering, of union. Us, together, a home. Nantan watched, his dark eyes missing nothing. He read the preacher's face, the exhaustion, the fear, but also the startling, stubborn sincerity. He saw the woman, Mary, who did not shrink from him but offered a small, tired smile. He saw the baby, sleeping safely in her mother's arms. For his entire life, he had been an outsider looking in. For the first time, someone was holding a door open. It was a choice he had never been offered before, not just to survive, but to belong, to trust. His eyes, which had held the hard, flat look of a survivor, softened for just an instant. He looked from Elias's outstretched hand to his face, and after a long, silent moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The sun was fully risen now, casting long shadows across the grass as the four of them walked back towards the town. They were a strange and unlikely sight. The disgraced preacher, his brave wife, their miracle child, and the deaf Apache boy who had saved them all. The streets of Redemption Gap were empty, the people hidden behind closed doors and curtained windows, watching. Elias knew the road ahead would be hard. They would be ostracized, whispered about, and tested at every turn. They had not earned the town's love, only its resentful silence. But as they walked, Nantan fell in a step beside Elias, no longer on the fringes, no longer a ghost at the edge of their world. He was with them. The space between them was no longer a chasm of fear and suspicion, but a fragile, newly forged circle of quiet loyalty. Looking at the boy's proud, straight back, and feeling the warmth of his wife's hand in his, Elias Thorne knew he hadn't lost his church. He had finally found it. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.